A deal that could end one of the most dangerous conflicts in the Middle East has just been announced. And the one country that should be celebrating is the one most furious about it. Trump made the call. Iran agreed to the terms. The Strait of Hormuz could reopen. But Israel? Israel is doing everything in its power to tear this agreement apart before the ink even dries. The question is, why? Welcome to the Professor Jiang Report, where we cut through the noise and give you the story behind the story, clearly and honestly. It is wonderful to have you here today, and if this is your first time joining us, we genuinely hope you stay. Please consider subscribing so you never miss a single report. We would also love to know, where in the world are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below, because this community truly spans the globe. Now let's get into a story that is shaking the foundations of Middle East diplomacy. Something historic is happening in the Middle East right now, and it is changing everything. For months, the region has been locked in one of its most dangerous and destabilizing periods in modern history. Wars burning across multiple fronts, oil prices climbing, economies shaking, and millions of ordinary people caught in the middle, wondering when it would ever stop. Then came the announcement that almost nobody expected. The Trump administration revealed that a framework agreement, a memorandum of understanding, had been reached between the United States and Iran. The terms were straightforward on the surface. Iran would agree to end its nuclear weapons program. Not its entire nuclear program, but specifically the weapons development side of it. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical shipping lanes in the entire world, would reopen for free passage, and American forces would begin stepping back from the region. Simple, clean, and according to many analysts, long overdue. Iranian officials responded by saying they had been willing to accept terms like these for years. They pointed to at least 8 different previous negotiations where similar agreements had been discussed and then abandoned. Their message was clear: this deal was never impossible. The political will to reach it simply had not been there until now. So what changed? The answer lies not in the Middle East, but in Washington. Donald Trump, facing enormous pressure from Republican members of Congress, began hearing the same warning from nearly every direction. Polling numbers were collapsing. Inflation was hurting American families at home. Oil prices were climbing because of instability in the region, and ordinary Americans were feeling it every single time they filled up their car or paid their grocery bills. Republican lawmakers told Trump directly the midterm elections were approaching, and the economic pain caused by continued conflict in the Middle East was becoming a serious political problem. The stock market was under pressure, consumer confidence was falling, and the message from within his own party was urgent. Something had to change, and it had to change fast. Trump, who had spent the early part of his return to power giving Israel enormous military and diplomatic support, including striking Iranian targets and opening multiple conflict fronts on Israel's behalf, had apparently reached his limit. A peace deal, it turned out, was not just a foreign policy decision, it was an economic and political necessity for the United States. And that is precisely why Israel is furious. Because for the first time in a very long time, American interests and Israeli interests are no longer pointing in the same direction. Here is what the agreement actually says, and why Israel refuses to accept it. The framework between the United States and Iran is being described by officials as a memorandum of understanding. It is not a final signed treaty yet, but what it outlines is significant enough to send shockwaves through the entire Middle East. Under the terms being discussed, Iran has agreed to dismantle its nuclear weapons development program. This is a critical distinction that many people are missing. Iran is not being asked to shut down all nuclear activity entirely. The agreement targets the weapons-specific side of the program, the part that has kept American and Israeli officials awake at night for over 2 decades. Iranian leadership has publicly confirmed their willingness to comply, stating through official channels that this position is not new and that they have expressed the same readiness in multiple rounds of diplomacy stretching back years. The second major term involves the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway connects the Persian Gulf to the global ocean shipping network. Nearly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through it every single day. When Iran moved to restrict passage through the strait, global oil markets reacted immediately and violently. Prices surged. Inflation climbed in countries thousands of miles away from the conflict. The economic consequences were felt from London to Los Angeles. Under this new framework, Iran has agreed to allow free transit through the strait without imposing tolls or restrictions, though Iranian officials have quietly noted that certain arrangements may still apply, leaving some room for future negotiation over the exact terms of passage. The third component involves American military positioning. The United States would begin drawing down its active involvement in the region, effectively stepping back from the role it has played as a direct military participant in recent conflicts. Now here's where the story takes a sharp and dramatic turn. Trump announced publicly that this agreement covers Lebanon as well. He stated clearly that the ceasefire framework and regional de-escalation would extend to Lebanese territory, where Israeli military operations have been ongoing for months. Israel's defense minister responded almost immediately, and the response was a direct contradiction of everything Trump had just said. Israeli officials stated bluntly that Lebanon is not included in any deal they recognize. They announced that Israeli forces would remain in southern Lebanon indefinitely. They described their continued presence as a security necessity, a buffer zone to protect Israeli communities near the border. And they went further, declaring that military operations in Gaza and Syria would also continue regardless of any agreement reached between Washington and Tehran. Netanyahu himself then stepped forward and confirmed that position publicly, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Two allies, publicly contradicting each other on one of the most consequential peace agreements in a generation. When two powerful allies begin pulling in opposite directions on the world stage, the consequences do not stay contained to the countries involved. They ripple outward and touch everything. And that is exactly what is happening right now. Start with the United States. For America, this deal, if it holds, represents something genuinely remarkable given the circumstances. The United States entered this conflict period from a position of strength and emerged from it having tested Iranian military and strategic resolve directly. Iran did not blink. The Strait of Hormuz remained under effective Iranian influence throughout the entire confrontation. Washington found itself in the uncomfortable position of realizing that reopening that waterway without Iranian cooperation was simply not a realistic military option. That is a significant admission for the world's most powerful military nation. And yet, despite that difficult reality, Iran has offered to open the strait without a toll. Iranian leadership did not have to offer that concession. They held the stronger hand at the negotiating table, and they knew it. The fact that the strait could reopen under relatively favorable terms for global shipping is being quietly described by economic analysts as a better outcome than many people inside Washington privately expected just weeks ago. For American families, the implications are direct and personal. Oil prices have been climbing steadily throughout this conflict period. Inflation has been squeezing household budgets from coast to coast. If the Strait of Hormuz reopens and regional stability begins returning, energy markets are expected to respond quickly. That means lower fuel costs, easing pressure on supply chains, and a gradual reduction in the inflation that has frustrated American consumers for months. Republican lawmakers understand this connection clearly, which is precisely why so many of them push Trump toward a diplomatic resolution rather than continued military escalation. Now look at Iran. Iran emerges from this chapter in a strategically stronger position than it entered. Its nuclear program, at least the weapons development component, will face international monitoring and restrictions, but its ballistic missile arsenal remains untouched under the current framework. Hezbollah in Lebanon has not been asked to disarm, and the new generation of IRGC leadership, younger and considerably more hardline than their predecessors who were assassinated in earlier strikes, remains in command of Iran's military apparatus. Iranian hardliners are actually expressing dissatisfaction with the deal, not because Iran gave too little, but because they believe Iran gave too much by agreeing to open the strait without guaranteed compensation. That internal tension inside Iran is worth watching carefully. And then there is Israel. Israel's position is the most complicated consequence of all. By pressuring the United States to pursue aggressive military action against Iran, Israeli leadership gambled on a specific outcome: a weakened Iran, a dismantled nuclear threat, and a reshaped Middle East landscape favorable to Israeli strategic goals, including the broader territorial ambitions critics have described as the Greater Israel Project. That gamble has not paid off. Iran has emerged with hardliners in charge, ballistic missiles intact, and regional influence undiminished. Hezbollah has not been disarmed. And now Israel finds itself publicly contradicting its most important ally at the exact moment when American political will for further military support is visibly shrinking. The consequences of that miscalculation will define Israeli foreign policy for years to come. Now that you understand the full picture, the deal, the defiance, the consequences, and the competing interests, it is time to ask the questions that truly matter going forward, because this story is far from over. The first and most immediate question is this: what does Trump actually do next when Israel continues its military operations in Lebanon, in direct contradiction of his public announcement? Words and phone calls have already been exchanged. Reports indicate that Trump contacted Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu directly after Israeli forces struck the suburbs of Beirut over the weekend, and the conversation was described as tense and pointed. And yet Israeli officials came out the very next day and reaffirmed their intention to stay in southern Lebanon indefinitely. So the question facing Washington is no longer diplomatic, it is operational. Will the United States continue supplying Israel with the weapons and military support that make these operations possible? Because that is the only lever that carries real weight. Every serious foreign policy analyst watching this situation closely agrees on one fundamental point: strongly worded statements change nothing. The flow of American weapons and American funding is the only instrument of pressure that Israel's leadership has historically responded to. And here's the deeper question that viewers should be reflecting on carefully. Honestly, is the United States genuinely shifting its posture in the Middle East, or is this a temporary adjustment driven by midterm election anxiety that will quietly reverse itself once the political pressure eases? That distinction matters enormously. A genuine strategic realignment would mean a fundamentally different American relationship with the region going forward. A temporary political adjustment would mean that once elections pass and polling pressures ease, the old patterns reassert themselves and the region returns to the same cycle that has produced so much instability. History suggests caution about optimism in situations like this one. Looking ahead at what comes next, several developments deserve close attention in the coming weeks. The Memorandum of Understanding between the United States and Iran still needs to move toward a formal signed agreement. Iranian hardliners inside the government remain vocal in their opposition, and their influence should not be underestimated. The question of Lebanese sovereignty and Israeli military presence in southern Lebanon remains completely unresolved. And Gulf nations, who are reportedly being asked to contribute approximately $300 billion toward Iranian reconstruction as part of broader regional stabilization efforts, will have their own conditions and timelines. Each of these threads could either strengthen the peace framework or unravel it entirely. For viewers who want to stay genuinely informed as this story develops, follow official statements directly from the White House, the Iranian Foreign Ministry, and the Israeli Prime Minister's office, rather than relying solely on media interpretation. Cross-reference reporting from multiple international outlets, and pay close attention to actions rather than announcements, because in Middle East diplomacy, what governments do matters far more than what they say. This is the story of a region at a crossroads, and the direction it takes will shape global security, energy markets, and the lives of millions of people for a generation. At the Professor Jiang report, the commitment is always the same: to give you the facts clearly, to explain the context honestly, and to trust you with the full picture. Because an informed world is a safer world. Thank you for watching the Professor Jiang report, and thank you for staying until the very end of this story.